Hello and welcome to the Global Hearth. Today, we're joined by two leading developmental psychologists from the University of Oregon. Professor Jeffrey Measelle is the co-director of the university's Center for Global Health and studies how early life stress, nutrition, and caregiving shape children's development. His work spans from families facing poverty in the U.S. to international partnerships in Southeast Asia, where he's led projects on maternal nutrition and infant health. We're also joined by Professor Baldwin, whose pioneering research in infant neurocognitive development shows how babies use social cues like eye contact, gestures, and tone of voice to learn words, emotions, and to develop relationships. She has spent her career uncovering the building blocks of early learning and helping us understand what helps children thrive. Together, Professors Measelle and Baldwin have collaborated on international projects tackling malnutrition and brain development, combining their expertise in physiology, nutrition, and social learning to design interventions that support children and families around the world. Welcome to the Global Hearth, Dare and Jeff. We're so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
I'm really incredibly grateful to have this opportunity to be in conversation today, in part because I personally find your work really touching and really engaging, inspiring, and in part because the more I learned about your work in particular, the more I began to grasp how vast the field of psychology is. When I think of psychology, my first reference point might be therapy, a really practical application in just daily life and communities. But I wonder if you might help us orient to your discipline and perhaps for any, armchair psychologists listening in or students who are interested in this discipline, could you help us understand what the primary pathways are in the field of psychology and how you arrived at your own specialties?
Sure. Psychology indeed is a very, very broad discipline. And so in some sense, it's an inherently interdisciplinary discipline. And we have psychologists who are studying single cell functioning, all the way up to psychologists who are studying the dynamics in societies and how societies interact with one another. So, and everything in between. And then we have developmentalists who study the developmental emergence of all of those different levels. So indeed, it's an exciting field to be in. One certainly is not possible to get bored at all. So the origin story was one part of your question, like, how did I come to psychology? I'm interested to hear yours too, Jeff. Well, I was pre-med and I was starting to move along with pre-med, and along the way took a psychology course as a gen ed course, and I just loved it. And then every other psychology course that I found myself taking, I just loved it and decided this must be for me.
Can I ask what you loved about it in particular? What was different about psychology from some of the pre-med courses that you're taking or the other ones?
Maybe the breadth of it, because it's so interesting to learn about things at so many different levels of analysis, and then also the heart and mind part being equally attended to.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, I'm really hearing in your description kind of like levels of scale that are kind of inherent in the discipline.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah. Does that resonate for you as well, Jeff?
Yeah, it does. I especially appreciated how Dare described the complexity of this discipline. My own origin story, really. So I didn't take a single course in psychology as an undergraduate, which I think people always find really interesting.
Yeah.
That I'm sitting here and, as a professor of psychology. I actually was involved in advertising and in documentary filmmaking, and took on a project for a client that involved understanding the effects of pesticides on populations in Central Valley, California. And one of the key constituents that was being really harmed by pesticides were developing children. We were supposed to be covering this topic, and I knew zero about it. Living in the San Francisco Bay Area, decided I wanted to take some classes, so I enrolled in some alternative enrollment classes through UC Berkeley, and I stumbled on psychology and fell fast in love. And lo and behold, here I am, a lifetime later.
Yeah. Was it that it kind of helped you understand like what was happening on a developmental level as the impact of these pesticides?
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of,
Just trying to be authentic and fact-based in terms of, what we were going to be putting into this media piece that we were working on, just wanting to know scientifically what was going on. So I took basic courses in basic biological development and psychological development and cognitive development and got hooked.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. It's exciting to hear from people who are much further along in their discipline. I think for all of us listening, it's just like, it's one of those moments where you're like, how did we get here? And I'm hearing in both of your stories that kind of listening to what is actually enlivening and exciting for you. And then also a balance with like, okay, how can I be most of service here? Like, how can I be authentic, or how can I help understand this at a deeper level? So one of the things that I've learned about your research is that you do long-term developmental tracking, and that your research has shown that children who don't get enough key nutrients, they struggle with attention and memory and problem solving. And these same children are then also more likely to face difficulties regulating emotions and forming relationships, potentially throughout their lives. And so the challenges can last into adulthood and affect all aspects of a person's life, including education, job prospects, overall health. And so your work highlights that malnutrition is not only an individual problem, it also has global impacts. It reinforces cycles of poverty, and it limits human potentials and has real impact in communities. So I'm curious if you could give us an understanding into how exposure to early life stress, such as malnutrition, how does that influence children's emotional regulation?
So you've probably heard about physical stunting that emerges when children are severely malnourished. And the phenomenon that we're studying, you might call cognitive stunting, because as the body is experiencing malnutrition, the brain is deprived of important nutrients at a period of development when those nutrients are essential for setting up structures that will support higher level cognition, including self-regulation, frontal lobe functions. And so early life experiences can show critical period patterns, meaning that when children don't have what they need for adequate development, the period for plastic change in the typical direction closes off. As a result, the brain is left in a place where it never does actually achieve what would have been possible had the environment been more supportive and provide adequate nutrition. So that means that, perfect remediation at some time later in life is often not possible, which yields this cognitive stunting pattern, which is affecting all sorts of systems. It's affecting sensory systems like visual system, auditory system. It's affecting what are sometimes called association networks, which is like language functioning, where brain areas that are actually operating on multiple sensory modalities simultaneously, where you're having to imagine objects, for example, hearing the words for those objects, processing how people are using their behavior with respect to those objects in order to be able to comprehend the language that they're producing. So those association areas also show critical period patterns on a more extended schedule. So sensory areas are in the early months of life. Association areas, we see critical periods closing off 4 or 5 years of age. And with the regulatory systems, it's even much later into adolescence that effects are ongoing. So the brain, very complicated set of networks, and each is being affected in different ways by the environmental adversities that are occurring. And often, of course, when children are experiencing severe malnutrition, they're also experiencing other kinds of adverse circumstances as well.
Right.
So they're compounding processes altogether, yielding this cognitive stunting pattern that can affect them over the course of their whole lives.
I'm starting to kind of get a sense of why intervention would be the methodology for approaching something like this, because you're dealing with something that's time-bound and that can have lifelong impacts.
Yes, exactly. And can I just add that the intervention that you're talking about is a systemic level, society level, population level intervention, so that we can prevent this cognitive stunting pattern intergenerationally, hopefully.
Wow, beautiful.
Something to add is a similar or different take on what Dare's describing is brains are built. One of the misconceptions is that sort of we're born with a brain that's just sort of ready to operate, and but it's dependent on input from the environment. So it's sort of being constructed as we develop. And as developmentalists, we're really interested in, as Dare was saying, critical periods. But just to make that really concrete, the first 1,000 days of life, which is roughly from conception to around 24 months of age, is that window of time. It isn't that, as Dare said, the brain doesn't continue to develop. It's going to continue to develop. Adolescence is another particularly sensitive period. But those first 1,000 days of life, I like to say, is when we've got to get it right. Because if we don't, those problems may be built into that brain, and it's very difficult to undo that going down the road. It'll take massive forms of interventions that may or may not impact an individual. And these accumulate at society level. So if you've got a society of children who were deprived of what they needed neurocognitively, that will play out at a societal level. So as Dare said, we're interested in impacting the neurocognitive development of individual children, but knowing that this is an intergenerational societal level problem if it goes unaddressed.
How do these finite periods interact with neuroplasticity?
So you've really got onto something there, because these critical periods are sometimes called sensitive periods. These are periods during which the brain is highly plastic and is open to registering and learning input from the world. It's open to restructuring during that sensitive period.
Right.
So exactly, the issue is that once you've moved outside of the sensitive period, the plasticity has radically reduced.
I see. So these are like optimal periods in which we can make the greatest impact for the benefit of not only individuals and families, but society as a whole.
Exactly. And that is the period during which the environmental resources that the brain is expecting need to be available. If those resources aren't available at that time, then the system is wired in a suboptimal way.
And I think what's really cool about our work is that we're talking about resources that are both biological in nature, but also social. So, the nutritional piece of it is babies are needing adequate nutrition, specific micronutrients, but they're also needing receptive caregivers in their world in order to prime and contribute to that early brain development. So you can imagine a system that's depriving the baby of what it needs at a nutritional level, but potentially also at a social interactional level as well.
Right.
We see that we're hypothesizing that the caregiving system itself might be disrupted by malnutrition. A mother, a father, other caregivers in the environment who are themselves malnourished may not be providing the sort of the critical inputs that baby is expecting and depending on. So it's this intergenerational phenomenon.
Yeah. If you're tired, if you're cranky, if you haven't slept enough, you're less likely to pick up on cues in your environment. And I could imagine that playing out in a parent-child relationship, being less attuned to the child's cues.
Yeah,
right.
You're
Exactly.
Catching on exactly to the idea there. And vitamin B1 is a micronutrient that we focused on specifically. And one of the implications of thiamine deficiency is fatigue and disengagement or apathy. So you can imagine how that might impact a caregiver and who has a tiny baby who needs a lot of sensitive and responsive care, but it's difficult to provide if you're fatigued,
Right.
and apathetic, and possibly depressed as well for other reasons.
Right. So I wonder if we could turn our attention to your work in Cambodia. So I wonder if you could tell us about your first travels to Southeast Asia and a little bit about this project that you've been working on and how it's structured, what you're looking at. Tell us more.
Some of it's accidental. I mean, personally, I was given an opportunity to do pediatric research in Laos, and that sort of started me down the path of being interested in, really, as a psychologist, how do global health kinds of issues play out at the level of individual development, children's development. Dare and I got this really great opportunity. Well, we've always wanted to work together and decided that we really wanted to pursue this particular opportunity in Southeast Asia. We were trying to get funding for research through the Gates Foundation for work related to what we've been describing. And in their wisdom, they said, well, we've got this nutritionist we really want to introduce you to who's needing support in terms of the cognitive pieces of what they're working on. We think you should talk. And that person was Kylie Whitfield, who's a nutritionist, researcher at Mount St. Vincent University in Nova Scotia. Long story short, we just sort of became fast friends and decided that this was a project that we really wanted to embark on together, and got funding to do this project in Cambodia, the one that you're referring to, which basically is a study that's attempting to supplement nursing mothers with levels of thiamine that we think are both needed for her, but also importantly to protect early neurodevelopment during those first 6 months of life when a baby is exclusively breastfeeding, when she or he's relying on mother for everything. And by supplementing moms with what we felt was hopefully adequate levels of thiamine, we could see whether, compared to children whose moms were not getting supplemented, that we would see the outcomes we were hypothesizing and predicting.
And so thiamine is this B vitamin, right? And this is the one that, Dare, you were speaking to, that can cause apathy and depression and kind of shut down. And so what you're looking at is if there's a thiamine deficiency in young mothers who are breastfeeding, that gets then passed to the children. And then if we give them an appropriate amount of thiamine, what would happen in terms of developmental effects?
Right. So we are interested in the extent to which providing supplemental thiamine might actually protect these babies at risk for thiamine deficiency mothers. And if we monitored their neurocognitive development, that we would see clear evidence of that protection.
Okay. Do you have a sense of what percentage of the population is affected by this circumstance?
Kylie Whitfield, who's the principal investigator of this team project, has done extensive research in Cambodia in particular. And my memory from her published work on this is that it's around 50% of the mother-infant population is at risk of significant thiamine deficiency.
It's estimated that probably between 50 and 60 are actually deficient, not at risk, but deficient. So
Wow.
There's evidence that upwards of half the population is probably clinically deficient, or what we often talk about sort of subclinical. And thiamine's interesting because, especially in babies, there's a real difference in what you're going to see for a baby who's clinically deficient in terms of thiamine and a baby who's just below that clinical level. And I know one of the topics you were interested in talking about was what's called infantile beriberi, which is clinical forms of thiamine deficiency. In babies, that's lethal. When a baby arrives at clinical levels of thiamine deficiency, it's usually a matter of hours before that baby is going to die. The symptoms of thiamine deficiency present in a way that it's a variety of symptoms that are often misinterpreted. They're often seen as other things that are not going to be lethal, but in fact, if it is thiamine deficiency, it's going to be lethal. And at that subclinical level, they may not die because of it, but they're being impacted cognitively and developmentally. So it's really a tragic situation because you give a baby a vitamin B1 injection who's on death's door, and within 2 or 3 hours, that baby is happy, thriving, and, is nowhere near.
No way. It works that quickly.
It works that quickly. And so imagine, just population levels of individuals who are just moving towards that level of deficiency when we're talking about infants. If upwards of 50% of these babies are moving in that direction, that's a lot of babies who are at risk.
Why does this deficiency exist to begin with? Is it the foods that are being eaten, and is it the way that they're processed? Could you give us some context there?
Right. That's an important part of the whole picture, which is that we tend to see populations at risk of thiamine deficiency when the cultures are relying on a steady diet that is thiamine poor, when people are relying on polished white rice to a high degree in their daily diet, because the polishing of the rice has rendered it absent of thiamine.
Okay.
And interestingly, Jeff and I were talking about this not long ago, that it seems like, isn't this an easy solution? We introduce unpolished brown rice to the population and we solve the problem. But there are interesting trade-offs.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The fact that countries like Cambodia, Laos, Madagascar, these are countries that have very monotonous diets, meaning, they're relying on a primary crop. The reason why those societies are really only consuming white rice is because they're producing a crop that's being exported to countries like the United States, to China, to South Asia, where there's a big appetite for polished white rice. Even though you and I might say, yeah, we eat brown rice, the population at large really prefers white rice. So we're taking this vital crop and we're rendering it nutritionally sort of devoid. But as Dare's suggesting, the alternative would be to protect the population by not having it produce white rice and to rely on brown rice. But brown rice actually has really high levels of arsenic in it. And in countries where the diet is largely rice, there's a lot of global influences there. A lot of hydroelectric dams are being built in these parts of the world, which is contributing to greater contaminated levels of groundwater, which is where arsenic leaches into these crops. So you've got this double-edged sword. The white rice is depriving them in one way, and brown rice, because it's toxic, is potentially problematic in another way. The responsibility isn't just a local responsibility to sort of solve these dietary issues, where we look to the rest of the world to see how some of these forces are playing out in these countries.
So what is the proposed solution then for addressing this problem? How do we get more people access to the appropriate levels of thiamine?
We don't actually have the full answer to that yet. As soon as we have solid level evidence that thiamine indeed is protecting babies' health, their well-being, and their neurocognitive development, and we have good information about the right dosage levels to produce that benefit, and we are absolutely assured that there's no risk of harm from introducing this, then we can go forward with potentially protecting the whole population through a food fortification program. So we've considered in particular fortifying salt. Salt is a fortification vehicle that we use in the United States with iodine, for example, and known to work very well. And actually in Cambodia, the salt is fortified with iodine, although unfortunately there is a fair amount of black market salt that isn't fortified.
I see.
And that's one of the issues that has to be solved, how to assure that if we're fortifying salt with thiamine as well as iodine, how to assure that most people receive that salt, that fortified salt.
Gotcha.
But one other thing to say on the topic is our colleague Kylie Whitfield has considered other vehicles. She actually, in her dissertation research on the topic, considered fish sauce as a vehicle for thiamine because fish sauce is consumed quite widely in Southeast Asia and Cambodia in particular. And it turned out through her research that she discovered that not everybody uses fish sauce. So some people are really averse to it is one problem. Another problem is that people like to make their own, that they flavor in a particular way, and they don't necessarily want to go out and buy a fish sauce that's less palatable just because it has thiamine in it. So she ended up deciding not fish sauce, let's look at salt next. And so we did do some preparatory work, sort of laying the groundwork in the research that we've already undertaken, where we explored how much salt people were consuming on a biweekly basis in order to get a sense of how much thiamine needs to be fortified in order for people to have adequate levels. We also tested whether this was black market salt or not by checking whether it had iodine in it, so we could understand the level of the black market incidence or prevalence. At this point, we are still thinking that fortification could well be the best strategy, but we continue to consider other strategies. And in part because there are some interesting complexities. Kylie, with other colleagues, has actually tried fortifying salt with thiamine as well as iodine, which unfortunately has made the salt not taste normal and also not look normal. So there are like shelf stability issues, there are palatability issues, and the list goes on. So there are some complexities in terms of the right way to make this happen. There's always the stopgap measure of simply offering people supplements.
And that actually is probably, in the near term, the optimal way to go, especially if we're targeting newborn developing babies. So moms in this country are taking prenatal vitamins that are replete with a lot of the important minerals and vitamins, and those strategies are being used in lower income countries around the world. So one of our immediate strategies is to figure out, as Dare was saying, what that right level might be, what the right thiamine levels would need to be, and introduce that into what are called multiple micronutrient supplements that would start prenatally. And our data shows that those babies whose mothers had thiamine deficiency or lower levels of thiamine during pregnancy were born deficient themselves. But then that just introduces yet another problem because, as Dare's saying, these are intergenerational concern. So we need to target women of reproductive age before they conceive so that they come to a pregnancy already nutritionally viable and healthy. So that supplementation strategy, if it's just targeting pregnancy, is probably not enough. That's where the fortification is at a population level is going to be so important to break this intergenerational cycle.
I see. When you're looking at an issue, of course, on a societal level, there's endless amounts of complexities. And it seems like a lot of where the energy goes in research like this is really understanding what you're up against and then using that as fuel towards finding those solutions. Because once you realize where the true barriers are, it's like, who else in the field? Oh, Kylie's studied this. Or maybe one of our listeners even is having an idea at this moment of just like, well, what about this? And that process of working an idea, even if it's a grand problem on a vast scale, we're looking for that gold standard of, we know that this actually is going to make an impact. And that we're not saying we have all of the answers or that it's an easy solution, but that we're going to work together across cultures to work towards solutions that are going to really make an impact on people's daily lives and communities. I'm curious about how you might approach Khmer family in Cambodia. Especially, I'm just thinking about the number of my friends and community members here who have become parents and what an intimate journey that is, how many different competing messages you get about what to eat, what not to eat. And in some of your research, we came across food taboos that are pretty common in my families. And I wonder how you approach that cross-culturally when dealing with a taboo. I'm curious what taboos are from a psychological perspective. So maybe that's one part of my question. And then secondarily, how do you work with families to introduce these new concepts at such a vulnerable time in a family's life?
You know, the topic of food taboos, even though that is, as you're referring to, a paper that we were a part of, it's a great example of how a team science approach allows us to sort of see and be a part of all sorts of different kinds of questions related to this single topic of early nutrition. I personally don't know very much about what the specific food taboos are in a country like Cambodia. I think one of the things that we do focus on is what's in a diet that actually is contraindicated or might be problematic for the body's ability to absorb the nutrients and micronutrients that it's getting. So from a scientific point of view, those are the taboos that I think about. So betel nut, which is something that is often chewed, it's sort of like a chewing tobacco kind of experience, really renders thiamine inert. And it's used to both manage pain and oral discomfort. But one of the byproducts of it is that it's rendering thiamine and some of the other micronutrients inert in the body. It's not necessarily a taboo, but it's having this problematic effect. When we're conducting these studies, and the only way these studies happen is through really strong working partnerships with Cambodian colleagues who are deeply embedded in the communities that we're working with and studying. And those trusting relationships are the basis for us being able to do this work. And it's those trusting relationships between families and our Cambodian colleagues that allow us to sort of look at what those dietary practices are, address the ones that maybe are concerning, but it is complex.
Yeah, just endorse the importance of the close working relationships with Helen Keller International, which is an NGO that's well established in Cambodia and many other countries. They are then hiring Khmer native speakers as our actual research staff who are fully acquainted with the kinds of issues that families are experiencing with the birth of a baby under complex living circumstances that are very challenging, and being able to be very genuine with families and not trying to interfere with their practices or belief systems, but trying to make it possible to participate in a study like this and have it feel beneficial, not only for themselves potentially, but for the culture more broadly. So Jeff and I had the privilege to go to Cambodia to help train the staff and how to carry out the neurocognitive tasks that we designed for the study. And these are such thoughtful, talented, hardworking, determined, dedicated young researchers who are traveling to rural village homes every day of the week after week, month after month, often in monsoon rains, down muddy tracks for 2 hours, carrying heavy backpacks with equipment, and again, day after day, week after week.
Wow. I'm really struck by how broad the scientific community is And it also sounds like there's a real sense of receptivity of like, we know that this is a problem in our community and we're really looking for solutions here, and that there's this broad international collaboration to address the issue.
Yeah, it really struck me how the families who participated in the study really embraced their participation. It was over quite an extended period, and they had to take daily capsules, and there were long questionnaires and long sessions where babies are getting fussy and falling asleep, and all sorts of things are happening. And yet they're determined to participate. They want to participate. They're grateful for the opportunity to participate. And I think because indeed they know that they want a better future for their kids.
It's also important to acknowledge that Cambodia specifically, it's a very centralized government, authoritarian even. Oftentimes in these villages at the local level, people are essentially following very strict mandates that are coming from the government. So we have to be really aware of and sensitive to the fact that the families may comply or be willing to comply, not because they want to, but because they think they're being told to. So it's a dynamic that any researcher has to deal with, the possibility of coercion or possibility of unintentionally crossing an ethical line. But for us in working in a country like Cambodia, that's something that we have to be very conscious of. I fully agree that the families that we got to know and work with were really committed to the idea that this might be helpful to their own babies, if not the society at large. But it's not always the case that families were doing this because they were that inclined. They may be doing it or maybe have been participating because they felt they were being mandated to. So it's a fine line that we have to be very careful with.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's really important for listeners to know, and any researcher really, of maintaining a sense of mindfulness around, is this actually in integrity within our ethics, and keeping that in mind as you continue the research. I wonder if you could take us into one of those rooms where you are doing a survey, and what does that look like when you're working directly with a family, or even a story of a particular family that you worked with?
Whenever I'm thinking about actually being in Cambodia and being present, a particular image of a particular home, the first one that I went to comes to mind, which was a home in a rural village. This is a home that's freestanding on stilts, so you have to walk up a little ladder to get to the level where people sleep at night. And there are hammocks that babies can nap in and that adults can relax in, and there's usually a wooden platform that people will hang out on at a certain time, and there'll be a little table that is the kitchen that will have some condiments on it and a few bowls and utensils. There might not be electricity, there might not be running water, but at the same time, kids might have an iPad to play with. Adults are likely to have a cell phone, and they on occasion will have internet connectivity, and they see how the rest of the Western world lives in contrast to how they live. And so I think that must be a very interesting way to grow up, is to have an idea of other ways of life that are, quite different in terms of material goods. And then I'll say that there actually were significant socioeconomic differences among the families who participate in the studies. And so we did have some level of diversity in that regard, which is among the things that we've been trying to understand about the extent of the influence on babies' neurocognitive development of these different rearing circumstances. Not to say that we feel like we fully understand that yet. Among the things that women in Cambodia are facing is having to find work outside of the fields and at the home, and that, as with work anywhere, is often disruptive to breastfeeding. And that is really changing the pattern of babies' nutritional environment, as mothers are less able to exclusively breastfeed and needing to use supplements such as soy formula or milk formula, which are expensive, expose babies to often unsanitary water that can cause illness, gastroenteritis, and things like that. So there's another complicated picture there of social change.
Wow. This research is actually pointing us towards what's actually happening in the daily lives of people who have iPads, who are watching the Western world, but we're not necessarily looking back at it through a screen.
Right.
It strikes me that there's so much to learn from that reciprocity.
One of the other thoughts that was on my mind when you first posed this question, which is what I was sort of steering dare towards, I want to steer her back towards it. Is, it's a sort of another cultural difference that we encounter when we do this work. And there's lots of examples of sort of cultural collisions in terms of, life worldviews, etc. But really interesting one for us in this task, and dare take it over whenever you want, this task to get mothers and babies interacting with one another. And something that we in this part of the world take for granted is this idea that babies are very ready for and dependent on this sort of interaction between the caregiver and the baby. We have this term serve and return. The baby produces a signal, the caregiver interprets it and responds, and like a tennis game, it goes back and forth, and that's really the basis for emotional, cognitive development, brain growth, etc. Interestingly, this task that Dare Develop gets a parent to interact with their baby in ways that we find and found is not always natural to them. There's a perception, especially among fathers, that babies aren't really, just real in quotes, are not really ready to interact until they've got language.
Oh,
so we're sort of putting them into this task situation that's designed to, let's see what that interaction looks like. Let's see how thiamine deficiency interferes with the ability for this mother-baby pair to interact, asking her to do something that for some is maybe not culturally familiar.
Well, I'm so curious.
Right?
What did you ask them to do?
This is Dare's brilliance here. So Dare, you take it.
So we designed 2 different social interaction tasks, and one of them we call the primary engagement task. And what it's trying to elicit from mothers and babies is the opportunity for direct primary connection and mutually positive interaction. So we asked mothers with the primary engagement task to try to coax their babies to smile and to sustain that over the course of the task. And the other wrinkle to it was that we asked them to use a graduated set of tools or cues in order to elicit the smile, and then one by one to take them away. So the idea was that first mothers started just holding babies but looking away, being disengaged, and then after 30 seconds they would turn to look at babies, and they could use their face to try to coax a smile. And then after 30 seconds, they could add their voice and use their face and voice to try to coax a smile. And then after another 30 seconds, they could add touch in any way they wanted to those other cues. So that was kind of the peak of the task. And then they start removing first touch. After 30 seconds, they remove voice as well. Just the last portion of the task was using their face to interact with babies. So the task has this interesting step up, step down sort of structure. And the reason behind that is that there is prior evidence that thiamine deficiency undercuts the development of sensory systems like the visual system and the auditory system, possibly the system that supports receptiveness to touch as well. We don't know. That hasn't been probed before, but this was an opportunity to probe that as well. So by stepping the task up like that, we had the opportunity to see, did babies notice when the mother turned and looked at them and used her face? Was the visual system picking up on that information? When she added voice, did the auditory system respond to those social cues? Same question about touch. And then again, did their systems notice when those cues were removed? And so we hoped that it would give us more information in terms of babies' responsiveness at these various junctures as to what of the neural systems were especially affected by thiamine deficiency, or I should say by the additional support of thiamine supplementation, since that was what we were really studying.
Right.
So anyways, the task took a little bit of explaining to mothers in order to get it set up, and then the researcher would cue the mother at each of the 30-second intervals as well to help scaffold that throughout. And some of the differences that we see in a Western country like the United States, we tend to be pretty flagrant and flamboyant in the way that we interact with babies. So we use a lot of facial expression, we very excursive intonation, like, oh, look at you, my goodness, your baby.
Yeah, lots of like pitch and tone variation. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those are really effective ways to coax babies to smile. And in Cambodia, it seems to be quite natural that mothers like to elicit babies to smile. So that's not a foreign concept or desire there. But using the face and using the voice in the flamboyant ways that we do here in the West does not seem to be natural, as far as we could tell from the videos that we have collected of this task. And yet mothers and babies are having highly connected interactions. And we are also seeing that the dosage of thiamine that mothers are receiving is affecting the richness of those interactions. So
Wow.
we are undertaking analysis of how the baby responds over the course of the task. We're also looking at the richness of the cues and the responsiveness and sensitivity of the cues that the mother provides over the course of the task. And then we're also looking at the degree to which the dyad is able to gel, the dyad being the formal term for a mother-baby pair. So we're looking to see the extent to whether the thiamine supplementation supports this kind of direct primary engagement that we were trying to test for. And this is ongoing work. We have quite a bit of data on this task and have seen implications of thiamine supplementation for how babies are responding to mothers in the task, and that more thiamine is better. Babies are showing higher levels of responsiveness in the task, looking like the neural systems are just ready to detect and respond in babies who are receiving adequate levels of thiamine. But this is an opportunity for me to say that we've been talking as though Jeff and I are the only ones at University of Oregon working on this project. But in fact, we've had this incredible orchestra of students, both graduate students and undergraduates, working on this project over the course of now 5 to 7 years. And these are just such engaged students. They've worked very, very hard to do hundreds of hours of video coding on these tasks and other tasks that we also collected data on. We've had 6 or 7 honors theses come out of this. We have students who participated in the published articles that have helped us with expert data analysis, as well as leading whole teams of coders and co-authored papers. And just as an example of that, most recently, Valerie Owusu-Kieno is working in this on her Clark Honors College thesis, and she was nominated as a Rhodes finalist and was in Seattle just a couple weeks ago interviewing as a Rhodes finalist. She went to the Olympics of academics.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
That's incredible. It's really interesting to hear about the ways that students get to engage with this work in the classroom, but also in the field. And I wonder, what is a day in the life of a student in one of your labs? What might that look like? What are the tasks that they're working on, or the questions that they're asking, or perspectives that they're bringing to the project?
Yeah, so students who are working on a thesis, for example, like Valerie and a number of other students, we work together with them to find out which angle on a particular task they might be especially interested in pursuing. And then we develop the way that they're going to extract the data, and that often involves they need to recruit and actually coordinate a whole team to help them pull that off. So that's a very rich experience already and requires a lot of resourcefulness and dedication. And then they spend like hundreds of hours coding these videos when it's the engagement tasks. And for example, the primary engagement task we had mothers of babies participate in at 3 different time points within that 6-month period that the supplementation continued. And there were 335 mother-baby pairs in the study. A number of the theses actually include that whole body of data. They pulled that all off in the course of their undergraduate career.
Wow.
So it's an enormous accomplishment, and several of these have been award-winning theses.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that and for bringing the students in. Yeah.
Something to add to that would be that oftentimes when you think about research laboratories, I think one of the sort of common impressions is that, there's a principal investigator who has a laundry list of things that he or she needs. Research assistants, usually students, undergraduate and graduate students, need those students to work on those specific tasks and projects. And that is the case often. But I think a strategy that both Dara and I have used is that we really want a student who's interested in the work we're doing to identify a question, identify a piece of the data that we have that they're excited about, and to make that be a big part of what they're doing in the lab. We have so much data. We benefit from students coming in with a whole variety of different interests. Along the way, they'll be helping us achieve the goals that we have. But really it works best when they're working on a project that they're excited about. As Dare said, it could be a thesis, it could be all manner of projects. But from my vantage point, it really works best when the student is working on something that they themselves are really interested in, separate from, hey, I need you to do this for me in order to get this, opportunity in a research laboratory. From my vantage point, it works much better when they're engaged in something that they want to be doing.
I'm hearing a full circle just in terms of how both of you ended up doing this kind of work by following your own passion and curiosity, and then a sense of kind of seeing that in the next generation, and a real encouragement to young people, to students, to really actively engage in the learning process and follow your own curiosity, that's actually well received by your mentors, the people who are in your field who've walked that path before you. That's actually the thing that you can do that's most directly going to contribute to the work as a whole, is being yourself and following your own.
That is so spot on. And it becomes such a win-win that the research gains enormously from these talented, bright, hardworking young people. They're gaining so much in terms of learning a set of skills and a kind of literature and a set of goals for research. And then also we're able to mentor them in terms of helping them transition to the next phase of their training or career as well, which is something we take really seriously and enjoy very much. So I do just want to register how proud I am of this orchestra of students, and every single one of them making so many very rich contributions, and I'm so proud of them.
Yeah. Maybe as just a last question, I'm curious if there's anything that you've learned from your time in Cambodia about children or about parents, about families that struck you, or just that was surprising to you or touching, moving, inspiring in terms of working with families in Cambodia, and then either your own experiences here. I'm curious, what has this taught you, this pursuit, this question that you've been following?
This is a slightly random association, but Valerie was telling me one of the questions she was being asked during the Rhodes interview as a finalist, and she's been working on the primary engagement task and pursuing the questions about the mother's level of responsiveness and sensitivity and the extent to which thiamine supplementation might support the mothers in being able to interact more responsively and sensitively with babies in that task. And one of the questions was to her, do you think that might be about love? She had to pause for a minute, she said, and the answer is yes. Of course, it's completely about love. It's completely about whether mothers and babies are able to engage with love. And so it's so apparent as you're watching these interactions, and it's also apparent that can be vulnerable, and it can be vulnerable to something as silly as lacking a particular micronutrient, thiamine. And so for me, that's one of the things that comes away from it, just the responsibility of supporting this love that is what we all need from bottom up onward to thrive. And I see that there. I see it here too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to pick up on that. For me, one of the things that's really hit home best and hardest is that families in Cambodia, families in Southeast Asia, when we're working in Madagascar, we also see it similarly, express that love, that commitment, that care for their child in ways that both overlap and are also very different than how we might express it here. And it's always a really wonderful reminder that, and a note of caution, that there are many ways to show that love, and there's no one right or one wrong way. We often export a view into these research contexts that could be interpreted as, or could suggest that we really think this is the way in which children should be raised, or this is the way in which we should properly nourish children. There's just a lot of different ways in which families are successfully raising their children in these different cultures around the world. And it's a great reminder. And so a really easy example is, Dare was describing the housing, the way in which families are living in Cambodia. Underneath those houses, in that common living space that's outdoor, there's often an open fire. And you see infants toddling around, crawling around, and coming right up to that fire. And, my initial reaction is like, oh my God, I got to, like, help, this. And watch the parents and they have complete trust in their child and an infant that the infant, has some sense
Right.
of this as being either a potential source of danger. Anyway, that instinctive move on my part to sort of jump in, is not the model that a parent there might be using. It's an example of, these lenses, these biases, these assumptions that we bring into this work. Those need to be checked at the door because there are lots of other ways in which families are raising children around the world.
And I hear this deep sense of mindfulness, integrity, that actually the way in which this work is even being approached is also done in a loving, caring manner, because otherwise it wouldn't be in the spirit of the work.
Nicely put.
Thank you. Thanks so much
Yeah.
for this conversation.
It absolutely, been so lovely to have you both in studio. Thank you so much for sharing and for your breadth of knowledge and care and transparency about how you're approaching these really difficult, complex questions. I wonder if you might be up for a quick fire of questions.
Sure.
Okay. First one being, what's your favorite Cambodian snack food?
Fried tarantula.
No way.
Yeah.
Not really. Maybe not my favorite, but it's like a bragging right. Yeah.
Totally.
It comes out live in a little like bamboo cage. You get to meet it before it goes off, and I don't.
Truly farm to table.
It is
You have
farm
a
to table.
relationship with your food. How do Cambodian children play as opposed to American children? Do you see similarities, differences? What do you notice in their play?
I see a lot of physical activity.
Yeah.
Kids are running around a lot, climbing and running and playing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
it's fun to see.
interacting with, all manner of creature, right? As
Yes.
Dara was describing, a baby's crawling, ambling around, children are running around. There are pigs, there's roosters, there's chickens, there's goats, there's dogs. I mean, there's just all manner of animals, and they're just sort of moving around one another in this fluid way that's, fascinating to watch.
Wow, when you think about kind of like what the inputs are in a child's development, they're also
Totally.
getting those that
Totally.
stimulation of non-human species. One of the questions that I wanted to ask was, do you think that there's anything that all of us in this room live in the United States that we might learn from or appreciate most about Cambodian culture in terms of how you've seen parents and children in society interact?
I think about the really tough historical circumstances that people have had to experience in Cambodia.
Yeah.
With the genocide, the killing fields, and this ruptured the social fabric. And people are still experiencing the intergenerational trauma that came from that. And I think it may have affected even how caregivers interact with their babies. And so I can't fathom exactly in what ways, but I just see what I think may be lingering effects of genocide, and at the same time incredible resilience to something so horrific.
On the other side of it, a scene that I see regularly when we're working in Cambodia is one that I really have grown to love a lot. It's called the family pot. So families are cooking their meals in a single pot, and families gather around that pot and they share the meal in a way that's much, much more intimate than, even we in this country when we all gather at a dinner table. I mean, we're all eating out of the same food source, and we're, reaching in and grabbing our food and ladling it. Every time I see it, it's a really beautiful cultural expression of the way in which families come together around meals and share that meal. It just touches me every time I see it in a way that it's not that I don't experience that here, but it's just, that's the way every meal is experienced. It's a family gathered around and sharing that food source.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Jeff and Dare, thank you so much for being with us here in studio today. I wonder if we might close our time together with a poem.
And thank you. It's been lovely.
Right, I agree.
So this is a poem from Honor the Messenger, which is a book for poems for journalists in danger by Kim Stafford. And this is called Canary in the Mind. If you descend to sorrow, take a little singer to carry through the dark some color of the sun. Tunneling through trouble, guard your little light, shield your little singer for the good of everyone. If your singer falters, if your mind grows dim, if your breath grows shallow, if your days grow grim, feed your little singer seeds of hope again. In the cave of grief, with every breath, begin. Jeff and Dare, thank you so much for joining us at the Global Hearth.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you to our student producer, Ellie Johnson. Thank you to the director of the Global Studies Institute, Ellie Vandegrift, and our GSI team members, Megan Bogart and Hadil Abdelmaid. Thank you to Dean and Vice Provost of the Division of Global Engagement, Dennis Galvan, for your support and your encouragement throughout this project. Thank you to Sam Para for your work on the podcast artwork, as well as marketing and communication support. Thank you to our sound design and audio mastering interns, Journey Brinson and Julian Green. Thank you to the SOJC production studio, especially John Sharpie. Major thanks to composer Joe Kai, who composed our Global Hearth theme song. Many thanks to John Bologna, Charlie Dietz, Steve Rogers, Christopher Deredix, Peter Laufer, and Chris Chavez, and the Don't Shoot the Journalist team for concept development support. Thank you to former Oregon Poet Laureate Kim Stafford for your beautiful poetry. And most of all, thank you to you, our listeners, for your time and your caring attention. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can follow us on social media. We'll link it in the show notes. Please send any questions or comments to gsi@uoregon.edu. That's gsi@uoregon.edu. We would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again at the Global Hearth, same time next week.